The morning of January 22nd, 1943, found Second Lieutenant John George pressed into the debris of a shattered Japanese bunker. Through his telescopic sight, he tracked a banyan tree standing 240 yards distant, west of Point Cruz. For 6 weeks, his fellow officers had ridiculed that very scope. George was 27, an Illinois state shooting champion, and he had yet to record a single confirmed enemy kill. Somewhere in the groves around Point Cruz, 11 Japanese snipers were operating. In just 3 days, they'd claimed 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had dismissed his weapon as a plaything. Other platoon leaders nicknamed it his mail-order sweetheart. Back at Camp Forest, Tennessee, when he'd unwrapped the Winchester Model 70, complete with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount, the unit armourer asked whether he planned to hunt deer or Germans. George told him, "Japanese." Then the regiment shipped out before the rifle could catch up. During the voyage to Guadalcanal, George watched his comrades maintain their M-Yun Garons, while his own carefully chosen weapon sat warehoused back in Illinois. He filed paperwork to have it forwarded via military postal channels. 6 weeks dragged by. Finally, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate stamped "Fragile." Inside lay the rifle he'd spent 2 years of National Guard wages to acquire. At 9 pounds, the rifle was actually lighter than standard issue. The scope brought the total 9 pounds 12 ounces. Every other soldier in his battalion carried a Garand weighing 9.5 pounds, without any magnification whatsoever. George's Winchester was bolt action, 5 rounds maximum. The Garand? Semi-automatic, 8 rounds per clip. Captain Morris ordered him to stow the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. Instead, George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved Marine forces on Guadalcanal in the final days of December 1942. Those Marines had been locked in combat since August. They'd seized Henderson Field and defended it successfully, but Mount Austin remained in enemy hands. The coastal groves west of the Matanica River stayed contested territory. Mount Austin rose 1,514 feet into the tropical sky. The Japanese garrison called it the Gifu, a fortress position manned by 500 soldiers occupying 47 fortified bunkers. George's battalion launched their assault on December the 17th. The battle consumed 16 brutal days. 34 men died. Another 279 suffered wounds before American forces finally controlled the western slope on January 2nd. By that point, George had fired his Winchester precisely 0 times against the enemy. The terrain around Point Cruz presented entirely different challenges. No fortified bunkers, no static defensive lines, just Japanese soldiers who'd withdrawn west from Henderson Field and dug themselves into the massive jungle trees. Among them were trained snipers equipped with scoped Arasaka Type 98 rifles. They understood the jungle intimately. They understood patience even better. January 19th brought the first casualty, Corporal Davis, killed while filling canteens at a creek. The following day, a sniper eliminated 2 men from L Company during a routine patrol. January 21st claimed 3 more lives. One soldier took a bullet through his neck from a tree his patrol had already passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. Japanese snipers were killing his troops faster than malaria. He needed someone capable of accurate long-range fire. He wanted proof that George's mail-order rifle could actually strike targets. George laid out his qualifications: Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939. 23 years old at the time, youngest champion in state history, 6-inch groupings at 600 yards using iron sights alone. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, he could place 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until sunrise to demonstrate results. George spent the night examining every component of his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in cosmolin for its ocean journey. He cleaned it again, methodically checked the scope mounts for any looseness, loaded 5 rounds of .3006 hunting ammunition he'd brought from Tennessee, military ball ammunition, identical cartridge to what the Garand fired. At first light on January 22nd, George moved into the ruined Japanese bunker. His battalion had overrun 3 days prior. The position overlooked the coconut groves stretching west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese snipers operated from the larger trees in that zone. Primarily banyan trees, some reaching 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet in diameter. A sniper could climb one of those giants before dawn and remain invisible throughout the day. George brought no spotter, no radio operator, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began systematic observation through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan offered 2.5 power magnification. Modest, but sufficient to detect movement in the branches that would escape the naked eye. The jungle never fell completely silent. Birds called, insects hummed, artillery rumbled in the distance. George had learned to filter ambient noise and concentrate solely on movement. He glassed each tree methodically, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 a.m. he spotted it. A branch shifted. No wind, just a subtle adjustment. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards distant. George watched. The branch moved again. Then the shape resolved. A man in dark clothing positioned where 3 branches converged. The Japanese sniper faced east, observing the trail George's battalion used for supply movement. George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks right to compensate for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth at 3.5 pounds. He'd spent countless hours perfecting it at Camp Perry before the war began. Now he'd discover whether a civilian target rifle could eliminate a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester recoiled against his shoulder. The sharp crack echoed through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked violently and fell. He tumbled through the branches, his body dropping 90 feet before slamming into the ground near the banyan's base. George worked the bolt smoothly. The spent cartridge ejected. He chambered a fresh round. His scope remained fixed on the tree, searching for any response. Nothing immediately visible. But Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the primary shooter, the spotter remained concealed somewhere in that tree, or the surrounding ones. George scanned the neighbouring banyans. The scope's limited magnification forced slow, careful searching. Each tree could hide multiple men. The jungle canopy created deep shadows that made distinguishing shapes nearly impossible without patient observation. At 9:43, he located the second sniper, different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one positioned lower, perhaps 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was descending the trunk, retreating. He'd heard the shot and recognized his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement slightly and fired. The second sniper fell backward off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both weapon and body struck the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands remained steady. His breathing stayed controlled. This felt no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except these targets returned fire. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt across his face. He rolled left immediately and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had originated from the southwest, different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 full minutes before shifting position. He inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees southwest of his location. The shooter would have relocated after firing. Basic sniper doctrine, shoot and move. But in jungle, this dense relocation options were limited. George found him at 11:38. Third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. A critical mistake. George centered the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell silently. By noon, George had eliminated 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread rapidly through the battalion. Men who'd mocked his mail-order rifle now requested permission to observe him work. George refused every request. Spectators attracted attention. Attention attracted fire. The Japanese snipers adapted after the 5th kill. They ceased all daylight movement. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing useful. At 1600 hours he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery had vanished from his tone. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd opened with heavy tropical rain that transformed the jungle floor into soup, and reduced visibility beyond 100 yards to nearly zero. George sat in the bunker and waited for conditions to improve. The rain stopped at 8:15 a.m. By 8:45, sufficient visibility had returned for operations. George spotted his first target of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the downpour, intelligent timing, the sound of rain masked movement perfectly. This sniper had selected a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday's engagements, also intelligent. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for the increased distance and fired. The sniper fell. The sixth kill triggered an unexpected response. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began impacting the area surrounding his bunker. They'd triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound signature. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would obliterate the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater just as the third salvo hit. The bunker he'd occupied moments earlier disappeared in explosions and flying debris. He relocated to a new position, a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided adequate cover and maintained clear observation of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent additional snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. Now they were hunting him back. The dynamic had fundamentally changed. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. At 2:23 p.m., George killed his 7th sniper. At 3:41 p.m., he killed his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Excellent concealment, but the height created a distinctive silhouette against the sky when the sun angle shifted. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to retrieve George. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers initially operating in the Point Cruz groves, 8 now dead, 3 remaining. Those final 3 would be the best, the ones who'd survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and attempted to sleep. At 3 a.m, he abandoned the effort and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay dawn operations. George used the time to relocate to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese wouldn't anticipate. He selected a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43 a.m, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved steadily. George began glassing trees systematically. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out. Low elevation, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for superior sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level, but George wasn't at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks. The angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began applying trigger pressure. Then he stopped. Something felt wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He'd eliminated 8 men. The remaining 3 wouldn't make elementary mistakes. They wouldn't position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them easily, unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash ready to return fire. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. He checked every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28 he found the actual threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from three sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there, or to shoot at the bait in the palm tree. George faced two problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching for him. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it. A slight shift. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George centered the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east, a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He'd watched 10 comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics, he knew George's rifle, he knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees he was watching, waiting, planning. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification made distant shapes visible, but not necessarily identifiable. Every dark spot could be a branch, or a man. George had to study each one carefully. At 9:47 he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George caught the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using jungle floor vegetation for cover. Ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing was controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52. He'd reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks, searching for movement. For any sign of his target, George waited. Patience was the fundamental skill of sniper work. The ability to remain absolutely still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the same side George had used when evacuating under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had observed the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yards, an easy shot even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He'd outlived 10 other snipers, men who'd been killed because they made mistakes. This man wouldn't make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy. Another bait position. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving or repositioning, just watching. Waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He couldn't shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to prevent water from entering the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He'd spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or locate his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water, slowly, silently. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who'd been in the rocks. Now 42 yards away, George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze voices. Japanese voices coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers hadn't been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. The Winchester he held vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. These weren't snipers. Infantry. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater. Close enough that he could hear them clearly, even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation, urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again. Not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They'd found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He hadn't been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options: stay hidden and hope they passed by, or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting, more soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices. He ran 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low. He glassed the area through his scope, saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier, fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking one group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He couldn't win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact, move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They hadn't pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running, walking, staying low, using the terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices, no movement. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits, then a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills, 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field-stripped the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every component. Cosmoline and gun oil. Patches run through the barrel until they emerged clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George walk to headquarters, wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure. Operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time, and rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with inertial scopes. Sniper rifles left behind by the Marines. Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with uninertal scopes went to the men George would train. Training began on January 27th. George had 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They'd qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards, but none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment. George started with the fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the inertial scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the rifles stable but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to terrain and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, the roles could switch. This kept both men proficient and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on one shooter. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers, just infantry stragglers who hadn't yet evacuated. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20 a.m., a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt and scanned for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail, 7 shots, 6 kills. 1 missed due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day, 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was conservative, only confirmed kills where the body could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle, without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson. Field doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he would recover, but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star, but George's war wasn't finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission. Something in Burma. Something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth. George didn't know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines. The kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet. The men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5307 Composite Unit was officially designated on May 28, 1943, but the men had been training since April long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, operations without supply lines. The unit was modelled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces that could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role wasn't officially listed as sniper. The army didn't have formal sniper positions in its table of organisation. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader. But Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal. but the principles remained the same: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma jungle would be worse: steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American force. George modified his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester Model 70 had performed well on Guadalcanal, but that had been short-range operations with regular resupply. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. The Weaver had the same 2.5 power magnification, but weighed 8 ounces less. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the Myitkyina airfield. The airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large forces: mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. The force would carry all supplies on their backs or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles and mortars, and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They had engaged Japanese forces 12 times: small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders weren't meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines, and create chaos behind Japanese positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards against a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, different from the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than combat. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 3,000 men was down to fewer than 1,300 effectives. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost had been severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived. But the rifle that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The Marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range precision shooting that required a scoped rifle. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. George realized something during those 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent rifle, perhaps the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would require different weapons, different tactics, but there would be no next war for George. Not immediately. By June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the Marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he'd learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma: how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had travelled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The need for individual marksmen with privately owned rifles was fading. The military was standardizing, mass production, interchangeable parts, soldiers with identical equipment and identical training. George understood the necessity modern warfare required industrial scale. But something was being lost. The individual skill, the craftsman approach to soldiering. The idea that a man with the right rifle and the right training could change the outcome of a battle. George was discharged from the army in January 1947. Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics. Graduated with highest honours in 1950. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as Executive Director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Service Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz. They didn't know about the Japanese snipers. They didn't know about the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. In 1947, George decided to write down what had happened. Not for publication, just for his own record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and suggested publication. George was reluctant. The book was technical. Detailed descriptions of rifles and ammunition and ballistics. Not the kind of content that interested general readers, but the NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1948 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians. The book described George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision. No embellishment, no hero worship. Just facts and observations about what worked and what didn't work in combat. The book is still in print today, still used as a reference by collectors and historians studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He watched the evolution of military rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal military specialty with dedicated training and equipment. He watched the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. But it isn't. It's the rifle that proved a state champion. Marksmen with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story resonated with you the way it resonated with us, I need to ask you for something. Hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to push this story to more people. Real stories, real heroism, the kind that deserves to be remembered. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're pulling forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real sacrifice. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure John George doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.